My name is Jeremy Likness, and if you're looking for the Silverlight 5 for line of business, you're in the right place. And I definitely want to start just by thanking everyone on two notes. One was I noticed in the agenda this year I'm actually a lunch option, so I know that choosing where you're going to go for lunch, and there's a lot of great competition, so thanks for giving me your time. The other is with the recent announcements about Windows 8 and HTML5 and JavaScript. I was wondering how people would take that and if they even wanted to come to a Silverlight 5 presentation. So it's very much alive and well, and we're going to talk about the features that will be released into the year, and we'll jump into that. So while we're giving thanks, so to speak, we obviously want to thank our sponsors. RecruitWise would be one of those sponsors, and you have the information there, as well as Telerik, who make several controls, which since my area is Silverlight, I am definitely a huge fan of Telerik. Doesn't hurt that they have some guidance for Windows Phone 7 that uses some of the projects I've worked on, which is kind of cool, but it's a very good tool set, very nice set of components, and we thank them for sponsoring as well. So the company I'm with is a company called Wintellect. The core corporate offices are actually based here out of the Knoxville area. So we're local to that, but we have a lot of consultants who are remote, and we're all over the U.S. And we do, as you can see, consulting, training, design, and debugging. We do mostly Microsoft Stack. We have some projects that overlap with other technologies, but that's a core focus. And if you want to delve into any of these deeper, you can go to the website, wintellect.com. So today we've got a lot of ground to cover in an hour, but I also want to make sure that I cover the things that you're interested in. And so obviously if we jump on a topic and you have questions, feel free to interrupt me. I try to build in some time for interaction during the project, and we'll definitely have time at the end as well to answer questions. So we're going to cover just a brief history, look at where we're at, and then we're going to dive into all the features of Silverlight 5. And I've purposely left out some of the media element features and some of the audio related features that aren't directly impactful for line of business applications. Not saying they're not used, but I wanted to focus on the ones that sort of have an immediate benefit when you're working on applications that are in commercial enterprise type environments. So let's start with just a brief history of Silverlight and go back to the beginning when it came out. And this was Silverlight 1.0 in 2007. And I'm just curious, has anyone in this room worked with Silverlight version 1.0? No one. Myself, I have not worked with it as well. We kind of called it JavaScript with benefits. And some people would argue the benefits. So when it really came out, it was a little bit of a confusing message. The original name was WPF Everywhere. And it really didn't do anything that WPF did in very many places. And it started, put the stake in the ground, got it kicked off, and started a lot of speculation about, is this just another movie player component? That's what I heard a lot in the early days is, oh, it's another Flash player. If at first you don't succeed, call it version 1.0. So the next phase in our history, put on our armor, so the renaissance, so to speak, Silverlight 2.0. Has anyone worked with Silverlight 2.0? So we have a few people who started that early. I actually came in at the tail end of 2.0 and very purposely focused everything on 3.0 for when it came out, and we'll get into that a little bit. So that was 2008, so it was a very fast release. Came right after 2007. Common language runtime. So this was no longer just a JavaScript runtime. We actually had a version of the core .NET framework stripped down for the browser to work with. We also had a dynamic language runtime. So now suddenly there were more possibilities for languages and ways to build the applications. And this is also the beginning of the integration with Deep Zoom, which is an amazing technology that I'm not going to dive into deeply here. And so with this, we got to really celebrate object-oriented code, right? So it can take small, simple problems and make them look like really large, complex ones. Because now we have everything. We have the .NET framework in the browser. So I say for version 3.0, that's when we really put our hard hat on and got to work. So this was when Silverlight reached a level Actually, a year later, 2009, we got 2D, 3D perspective, which allowed for some cool transitions and whatnot. So when I say 2D, 3D, it's not true 3D, it's transforms that give you that perspective so you can tilt something and you can do some simulation of what 3D looks like. We got GPU, which is huge, allowing the graphics processor to do what it needs to do. We got element binding, and this is by no means a comprehensive list, but these are some of the ones that popped with that. And we got out of browser, and out of browser was large, and this is what really launched my career in commercial applications with Silverlight, because we had customers who wanted an offline type experience. They wanted to be able to work on the application disconnected from the internet, and the advantage with Silverlight was that they could write it once and they could target the Mac OS X platforms as well as the Windows platforms. This was obviously pre that other iPad revolution. And this is when Ballmer really started pushing hard on the 3 screens in the cloud, the fundamental shift in the computing paradigm. So I say 4.0 is when we really got serious about the business. So we're no longer in construction. He's got his tie on, ready to go to work. And that was 2010. So you can see this is a very rapid succession of releases. We got webcam and microphone. Everyone was saying, oh my gosh, you know, there's a Silverlight, but I can't record anything. I can't get access to the microphone. We got HTML inside of Silverlight, so we can now host those online controls, and everyone who had built their own HTML parsers were just going, oh, should have seen this coming, because those were tough things to build prior to that, or else you did something creative with a div and overlaid it on the Silverlight application. We got the Managed Extensibility Framework, or MEF for short, which was really a first-class way of providing services like discovery, extensibility, modularity. I could launch a debate about inversion of control, but let's just say it fills a need in that space. That's going to be very annoying if it pops up continuously throughout the course of the app. So we got WCF ARIA, which some will argue was an amazing thing. Some will argue not so good. We got COM interop, which this was very large because there were a lot of legacy applications where not so much the user interface portion, but the business portion, something I've written to interface with a type of device. Now I can access that through a COM layer from my Silverlight front end. And we got Chrome support. Chrome would actually run Silverlight prior to this, but it wasn't officially supported until 4.0. So once that came out, it really hit the main browsers, the Safari on the OS X, the Internet Explorer, Firefox, Chrome. And at this point, if brute force doesn't solve your problems, then you aren't using enough. And I really think this is where Silverlight got into the enterprise, was through brute force. There was a lot of speculation, a lot of confusion. But by this time, people persisted. They were building applications that gained momentum, and it had really grown into its own. So I would say Silverlight 5 is a moment of epiphany. Anyone not familiar with the reference? For those who aren't, it's an obelisk, and it teaches people do things. It's great. So it's a large milestone. I'm not going to get into what that milestone is, because then the rest of my talk would be null and void. So we'll dive into that. And I always enjoyed this quote from Albert Einstein. Computers are incredibly fast, accurate, and stupid. Humans are incredibly slow, inaccurate, and brilliant. Together they're powerful beyond imagination. And that's really where my passion for programming in Silverlight came from, was this ability to create wonderful experiences in the enterprise with the technology. So let's talk a little bit about where we are. Why would I even think you'd be interested in hearing about Silverlight 5, especially in lieu of a lot of conversations? Is it going away? Is it here? And is it really useful in the enterprise? And I can tell you that I believe today, when you talk to most people, they take Silverlight seriously. They realize it's being used in applications. That wasn't the case even a year ago. when I came here and talked about building advanced applications, people still said, wasn't that just another media player? Are you really using it in line of business? So if you haven't seen these statistics, the Silverlight team blog published that there's 1 million Silverlight developers. Probably means 1 million people downloaded the Silverlight runtime. So, I mean, let's be realistic. But still, I mean, for making that effort and going there, it says something, right? It's more than a couple thousand. 70% penetration. This is probably the most argued and misconstrued statistic ever. And people say, well, what is the true penetration of Silverlight? And I'd say it'd be very difficult to give you a valid version. If we talk about Flash, the major competitor, every single video player in the world practically runs on Flash. And Silverlight has some great media player controls, but there's that decade head start that Flash got. So when we say it's on 99% of machines, what does that mean? How many are using it just to play a video versus doing something meaningful and interactive? And we really don't know. And when I look at this percentage for Silverlight, that's really the consumer percentage, because the space that I play in with enterprise, a lot of times it's behind the firewall and it's not going to report that statistic up. So I say take that with a grain of salt, but it has increased, which is important. Now this is something that I think is a neat statistic because I can back it from my own personal experience. So the way I was exposed to Silverlight was working on a desktop-like application that was delivered over the web. It was a mobile device management console, and we had features that you could look at the geographic location and drill down and see battery and lifetime and the path it went through. And we were building all that with web technology, and it was killing us. It was absolutely killing us because of what we had to do with JavaScript and cross-browser compatibility to make it work everywhere we wanted it to work. So I went out to look at what are some possible alternatives. Do we limit the target machines? Do we lock down and we only support this? And I saw Silverlight. And when we looked at the customers that we had, it really hit the target platforms and browsers. The main complaint then was that it doesn't run on Linux. And quite frankly, that was not the predominant concern amongst the customers we had at that point in time. So we did a proof of concept. We shifted over to building the application in Silverlight. And once we started putting out modules, we really looked at it and we said, man, we can take the drawing board and put it in production about 4 times faster than what we can do with ASP.NET. Part of that was the tooling, part of that was the layout, part of that was not having to manage state because it lives in the actual runtime. And part of that was just simply the tool set and the IDE and what went into that, but a large part was that I really only wrote it once. As long as the plugin there was there, I knew it would run faithfully on my target. I didn't have to do all this cross-testing. So they found about the same thing, about 1/4 of the cost, which I'll translate to, I think, a lot of development hours and testing and whatnot. But they also talked about 1/30th of the total cost, and this is the power of the runtime running in the browser. So being able to offload some of that workload. So instead of a bunch of thin clients hammering the server and having to scale in certain ways for the server to handle that load, it was offloaded and the clients were doing things locally. And then we've seen major enterprise adoption. I'm going to talk some specifics about that before we jump into it. So these are a few projects that I know I can share because we've got them as case studies for Wintellect. This is a science application that was an old WinForms application that modeled molecules and atoms. And it was a project to move that to the updated WPF and Silverlight technology and build it in a way that actually tried to leverage pieces of code. So this was not 2 different applications that we wrote. It was really one, application that presented itself through WPF and Silverlight. And the technologies allowed us to share a lot of that plumbing. 2010 Olympics health monitoring. What Microsoft needed was a way to manage all of their servers that were live streaming the Olympics event. So it was a huge push for Silverlight because it was all this video on demand being played through the smooth streaming servers, which were very new at the time those Olympics came out, and this really put that technology on the map. So they had a combination of live feeds as well as video on demand that you could go and stop, start, and replay. Well, they had this entire farm and redundant data center and everything else, but they said, well, what happens if, compression's causing issues with CPU and I need to turn it off, or maybe I need to turn it on because I have a problem with my network? And what if it's a configuration that I don't even know about? Well, we know most of the configurations are in XML, so if we can build a generic configuration tool that configures XML, we can hit most of the cases. So what we did was we built an application that put agents out on all these different servers. The Silverlight piece would let you point to a configuration file and it would pull it in, parse it out, give you a nice tree structure so you could drill down and see what the configuration file looked like, and then you could go and edit a piece of that configuration file. And then it would remember the path to that one piece of configuration, save that off as an instruction, and then you could blast it out to these agents who would then pick it up, find the corresponding configuration file, and apply the change. So something like a compression setting wouldn't change your database connection setting, or wouldn't change any of the sensitive settings that are specific to that machine. The reason why we use Silverlight was because the project started, I believe, in the September timeframe. And these were the 2010 Olympics starting in the January-February timeframe. And we also were suspicious that that deadline probably could not be moved at all. So we wanted to do it with something we knew that we could get it to market quickly with that functionality, and we did. And these are the statistics that you can read about how much information was moved. And this is not through the Silverlight application, but this is the system it managed while that was running. Did anyone use the Silverlight controller during the Olympics, toy around with it, participate? One person? Two? I'm wondering if maybe all of us Silverlight junkies knew about it and jumped on it and hit it, and not so much outside of that. So this was a financial institution that was building a SharePoint integrated project for risk management. And what they wanted to do was have a rich feature set with controls that were interactive, so I could drill into country and region, and I could visualize, and I could split apart my pie graph and everything else. And so the SharePoint integration is there, it's enterprise, and it works really well with Silverlight. We're able to build this, and what you're seeing here is a default style from a control, but the nice piece was that all of these are themable controls, so they could swap out and white label and brand it for customers. This was a project we did with Microsoft that is a social analytics tool. So what it does is basically you have a brand and you have people out on Twitter who are talking about your brand. I saw some Microsoft branding going on when they released the announcements about Windows 8, both from the HTML5 camp and the Silverlight camp. So this type of tool would go out and monitor that. And there's a back-end artificial intelligence engine that said this is good, this is bad, this is in between. So it's a sentiment engine. And so what you could do is track the overall sentiment of your brand based on comments on videos, on Twitter, on other social networks, and it would aggregate those into this dashboard. And then you could run campaigns. I imagine Toyota might have made use of this, for example, during a certain period of time while they were running a certain campaign for a certain incident, and to see if there's actually success. Are people starting to change the way they think about it and the things they say about it? Why I like this slide is what you see here, to me, and I'm aesthetically challenged, so I would never be able to design something like this on my own. But it looks almost like a mock-up, like a PDF or a template a designer would give me. And then as a developer, I go, oh my gosh, I got to make the application look like this? Are you kidding me? But it's not. It's the actual live running application. And that's the type of experience that Silverlight provided. We had a team of 4 developers working on the Silverlight piece in parallel to a team of about 12 designers going through the design process. That design actually changed 3 or 4 times, and it did not slow the development of the application because of that workflow that Silverlight enables. So they were able to make those changes, but because we agreed that no matter how you lay this out, we're going to show a video, or we're going to show a graph, a statistic. The data binding engine and XAML allowed us to adapt to those changes and integrate them throughout the workflow. Last one is Hooters. Doesn't really sound like line of business so much. And the reason I put it here is it's a very interesting case study in that the entire site was written in Flash and they were having major performance issues. So they did a proof of concept with Silverlight and found that they could overcome those performance issues with Silverlight. And these were issues with zooming in on images, with certain pop-outs, with games, a lot of other controls. And so we rewrote the entire site in Silverlight. It's pretty much the exact same site before and after, but went from Flash to Silverlight. So now we get to jump into the fun stuff, which is where we're going with Silverlight 5. And this is a take cloud that probably has some random things that I don't want in it, maybe some that I do. I grabbed it off the Silverlight 5 page, and let's take a look at what's there. So when I say miscellaneous post-beta features, you can go out right now, you can download the Silverlight 5 beta, and you can start playing with it. These are features that are promised to us but are not in the beta, so you can't play with these right now. So there's not too much I can show you. I can talk about it, so I thought I'd shove them in this slide and then we'd move along. Nothing to see here. So we've got WS Trust, which for the enterprise is very important because it opens up a new possibility for secured messaging. It's a standard security envelope, if you will. I know I'm oversimplifying it, but for SOAP message formats. We've got 64-bit. Now the one thing I do want to say about 64-bit is I think there's a lot of confusion about what 64-bit means. And a common complaint has been, why isn't Silverlight in 64-bit? And I would say, well, why do you need 64-bit? Well, it's twice as many as 32, so it must be better, right? And why aren't you giving us the better version? The reality is that the 64-bit is mostly an addressing scheme. It allows you to deal with more memory. I would argue that if you need that much memory in a browser application, that there's probably bigger issues, bigger fish to fry, right? We might need to go back to the source and look at this. However, it is important in the sense that there are a lot of existing companies that are building drivers and components and pieces that are 64-bit. And of course, those weren't compatible with that Silverlight application running, especially if it's an out-of-browser application. So I would say 64-bit's exciting, but it's not, hey, we're all going to write 64-bit Silverlight applications, because how many people here run the 64-bit version of their browser regularly? And just for those on the recording, I didn't see any hands. So people aren't really using them unless they have to, so it's more of a facility to interface with those existing applications. We've got immediate mode graphics, which some of that you can play with now through the 3D APIs. Some of that I believe is extended to the 2D. Hardware acceleration in windowless mode. I'm sure a lot of you saw the famous Internet Explorer 9 videos that it runs right on the hardware. Here's a fishbowl, here's someone else's fishbowl, and our fish swim faster. Well, if you wrote those fish in Silverlight, they swim faster in IE9 as well. It takes advantage of that layer of hardware interfacing. Direct access to USB devices. This is huge in the medical community. For example, there's glucose monitors and different medical equipment that reports and is updated and configured through USB, so that opens up access to that. Microsoft Office integration, full keyboard support in full screen. Now, for security reasons, the older versions of Silverlight limited what you could do with the keyboard in full screen mode. And the thought is it's a secured sandbox. So I don't want Jeremy writing an application that makes it look like my desktop and asks me to log into Windows and steals my password, right? So they've changed that, and there's an opt-in now that the user can do that, which is great for gaming and great for media where you want to control the media through the keyboard. And then finally, there's our friend at the bottom that we know and love, and some of us who don't know and don't love it don't get to know it. You don't want to. Platform invoke, pinvoke. And this is the ability to call, manage unmanaged code directly. So in the previous version, you could do that if you built a COM wrapper. Now there's a way to get to it. And I probably won't demo that code. In fact, I know I won't, because if you've worked at, how many people have worked with pinvoke through C#? So you know the pains and everything else. Well, now we get to take that and bring it into Silverlight. Having said that, it's not a decision, again, to say, hey, now I'm going to start writing apps that run directly off my SQL 2008 server, because I can p-invoke to an 8.0.NET DLL or whatnot. It's really if I have some existing drivers and legacy software, for example, a point-of-sale system that was written in unmanaged code and I need to interface with it. So this is more not a guidance, but a here, now we allow you to do something new. Any questions on the post-beta features? Great, so let's talk about text. Text has been a sore eye for Silverlight. And it's been difficult to write some first-class applications because we've had to do everything with text on our own. And I'm talking about things like multi-column formatting, spacing, and all of the things. For example, people think Silverlight Touch multi-platform, great for, say, an ebook reader. However, when you go to actually implement that ebook reader, you find the limitations of text that doesn't have this rich model that, for example, WPF has. Now, the Silverlight team made a very conscious decision not to have a 50 megabyte download for the Silverlight plugin. That would just obliterate the plugin. They kept it lightweight. So there's a conscious decision to leave some APIs out that would add heft to it. However, they're slowly figuring out ways to bring in little tidbits here and there that give us access to that experience and still keep the footprint smaller. So what we've got is this concept of overflow, which really the two most practical applications, and as with all technology, someone's going to be really clever and figure out something that none of the rest of us thought about to do with it. But the two most common you'll see is columns. So I can actually define columns and have the text flow from one column to the next. And the other is image overflow. So I have an image embedded and I want the text to flow around the image. And I'll show you a demo of how that works. There's controllable character spacing. So you used to be able to specify a font size, but you couldn't specify the spacing between characters. So really your option was to have multiple text blocks, each with one character, and manipulate them that way, which can get a little untidy, a little unwieldy. There's a crisper text display with pixel snapping, and so the way I understand pixel snapping being aesthetically challenging and not noticing these things myself is Silverlight runs on a layout that is a decimal-based layout. It's not based on pixels, it's based on a format that then gets mapped to, and that's one of the beauties of the layout engine in both WPF and Silverlight, is you can have different resolutions and size screens and you can map that into it. But what happens is, if you have some fractional offsets, you can have that pixel that is sort of a half a pixel, and it's only one pixel, and so anti-aliasing kicks in, and so instead of a white pixel, we get sort of a faint gray pixel and a faint gray pixel to create the illusion, and it makes text look really ugly when it's on that boundary. So pixel snapping says, you know what, forget the rounding error, just snap it to the next pixel, give me the text and make it look pretty. And then there's enhanced OpenType support, which I believe is a layer on top of TrueType. I have not done much with OpenType. So when we look at text overflow, I've got some XAML here that has a inspired paragraph, blah, 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 in a rich text box. And what we've added is a new element that allows us to target a place for it to overflow. So all that simply means is if whatever text is in here can't fit in this rich text box control, send the remainder to that one, and Silverlight will take care of all those computations for you. And so then this is a overflow that's sitting there ready to receive the content. And I showed several so that you can see you can chain these together. So basically, overflow additional text to this element, and then I'm a container that can receive that overflow text. With character spacing, I've got a slider that allows me to slide between 1 and 100, which is probably not practical because character spacing is 1/1000th of I believe it's a pixel. It's a very small amount that you space it. Then I have a text block, and there's this new property character spacing that I can bind to that value and change what the character spacing looks like. So set the leading spacing to this, and you see I'm just doing an element binding so I can move the slide, and we'll see that demo in a second. So here I have my Silverlight application, and what I've defined is 3 columns, or 3 rich text boxes, and then an overflow region that's actually down near the bottom. So you can see it doesn't just have to be columns. Now I've got my character spacing. So what I want you to see in the columns is that as I resize this application, you can see the text automatically flows into the other columns. And if I could actually get the resolution, maybe if I F11, you'll see some more of that text comes out of the bottom and pops back up into the columns. With the character spacing, with this block here, you can see as I drag it, voila, the spacing changes. So again, those two features are related to the display of textual data, but you can see it opens up a whole new realm of possibilities and control for the developers, whether it's help files, manuals, ebook type applications. So let's talk about threading. There's a few changes with threading. One I can show you, one I cannot show you. There's what's called a dedicated composition thread now. So this was actually borrowed from Windows Phone 7. And Windows Phone 7, if you're familiar, how many people here, just by a show of hands, know XNA? Or know of XNA? How about that? A bigger show of hands. So XNA is a graphics model. Petzold actually did a nice talk on the 2D XNA for the phone earlier today. And the phone allows you to mix and match Silverlight and XNA, which are sort of two different engines for getting graphics on the screen. And the XNA engine has a lot of mechanics. It has this concept of a game loop and cycles. You're dealing with a different model than Silverlight, where sort of all the rendering and everything else happens in the background. We don't have to worry about it so much. To introduce 3D graphics to Silverlight, and we'll talk about that a little later, they decided to maintain compatibility with the XNA interfaces. And to a limited degree, that's what we have right now. There's a composition thread, though, that helps piece together some of these drawings and render them to the screen that is separate from the UI thread. So you have the threads that your application normally runs in. You have a UI thread that is a dedicated thread that does input and output. So it's responsible for grabbing mouse clicks and key presses and everything else, and for drawing out to the screen. So you can imagine if you're doing something computationally intensive, you can get some response issues on that thread. The composition thread is this new thread that runs independently, and there's now the capability to have certain things run on that thread, and we'll see what that looks like. There's also decreased network latency. So the HTTP web request used to live on this UI thread, and the UI thread is a queued thread. It's a single thread, so as requests go to it, one has to finish before the next comes. So there's definite performance implications with running on that thread. And so these have been removed from that thread. I don't know if there's another dedicated thread or what the technology behind it is. And according to Microsoft, up to 90% less latency. But this is one I cannot show you, because I obviously do not have a network connection. So for the composition thread, there's a few things you need to do, and these are similar to what you do if you're using any type of 3D in your application as well. The first thing is in your Silverlight object control, the control that spins up Silverlight that's in your HTML page, you need to enable GPU acceleration, because all of this lives on the GPU now. It takes advantage of the graphics processing unit. The next thing you need to do is enable this cache mode and set it to bitmap cache. And so this tells the rendering engine that this is something that you can cache onto your thread and actually move and operate on the composition thread. That's actually where the magic is done to get that animation onto the composition thread. So here's my element that I'm saying is cacheable. Here's my animation that's going to target that element and do something with it. And then this will run on the composition thread because I set that bitmap cache. So let's look at a demo of what that looks like. And what I'd like to show you is a very exciting view of two spinning rectangles. And now I'm going to do some stuff on the UI thread, and let's see if you can guess which one is using the new composition thread. So I'm just going to check this box here. And we actually have an interesting scenario in that it doesn't project well at all. All right, that worked out great. So if you're actually looking at it on the actual laptop, you would see one of these spinning smoothly, and you'd see the other one shaking all over the place. I will give you the source to all these demos. That link will go up today, so you can download it and prove to yourself that it is indeed real. And let's go ahead and jump into some code real quick to take a look at what that looks like in code. So what we're going to do is move to our composition thread example. If we take a look at my XAML, I've got my checkbox, I've got two rectangles, and the main difference between these rectangles, can everyone see that okay? Is it zoomed in enough? So one of my rectangles here uses that bitmap cache, the other one does not, and they both have animations that point to it. So in my view model, which is the code behind, if you will, for people who do know MVVM, that's probably not the most accurate way to describe it, but this is what's driving the screen. And so I'm using data binding to bind that checkbox that says do stuff on the UI thread. So I've got my random number generator that I call Vegas. Figured it was appropriate. And I've got a delay that can be set here, which is basically saying, do I delay or not? What I didn't want to do is when I clicked off of that example is keep doing stuff on the UI thread and mess up all the other examples, right? So when you go off that screen, it actually stops that. And then I've got a dispatcher timer. So dispatcher timer is a special timer in Silverlight that runs on the UI thread. So the problem with having a separate UI thread is I may do something in a thread and say I want to update a color or put text on the screen, and if I'm not on the UI thread, that will fail because I don't have access to everything that's drawing it. So something like a dispatcher timer gives me access to queue that on the thread so it can impact the UI. And all I'm doing is on that thread, but remember, when I'm running on the UI thread, I'm the only one running. It's a single thread, so everyone else has to wait for me, and I'm going to sleep for a random number of milliseconds. So I'm saying, guess what? You know, whoever's waiting, you're going to have to wait however long. And so when it's checked, it sleeps. When it's not checked, it ignores it and just loops through, and that's how you see the difference. And so the advantage with the composition model is that even when I have heavy work on the UI thread for whatever reason, which you never want this much work, but this is another layer of optimization, that animation, that's just a repeating animation, can be cached to the GPU and run on that separate composition thread. Any questions about composition thread or threading in general? Data binding is probably where the people I know in the Silverlight community are the most excited about the changes for data binding. Data binding is really the heart and soul of XAML and what we call the designer-developer workflow, where I said we were able to let the designers design while the developers were developing. And there's been a lot of limitations, especially for people coming from WPF, where they have the full-blown engine, and then they come to Silverlight and say, I can't do this, I can't do that, you know, I feel like this while I'm trying to code. And so we got excited in Silverlight, and we said, man, we've got this, this, and this. And WPF people went, yeah, finally, you know. It's, so I don't know, I'm still excited about it. I didn't do as much WPF. So the four main areas that we have is a concept called style data binding, implicit data templates, ancestor binding, and data binding debugging. So we talk about style data binding. Styles are ways to encapsulate theme, basically. So maybe I have this really cool color. If I'm an XNA developer, maybe it's cornflower blue. And I want to use it throughout the application so I can create a style. And then instead of having to remember the hex for that color, I just say use the cornflower blue style. And styles are a little bit more powerful than that because they can really take any type of object that's a dependency object in Silverlight, and they can act on any property. Before, you could really just set it to something. Now you can actually bind it to something. And what that means is I can create a class that exposes cornflower blue and some shade of red that I probably don't know the proper name for, and my wife gets upset because I just say it's red, you know. And I can expose that, and I can cycle through these without changing the style. So every button can go to the button style, but that button style can change. So this is really theming for your application and dynamic theming. And so what we do is, my themes is a class I'll show you that exposes different types of properties, brushes, gradients. This is a style, and this is an implicit style. So because it's targeting grids, it says any other grids that come after this will get this style. And then we're saying the background is going to use the property called gradient brush that's on that theme, and we'll see what that looks like when I show the demo. With implicit data templates, this is another very exciting step. What you used to have to do is use something like a converter or some other mechanism when you had a list of items that you wanted to show, but you didn't necessarily want to show them the same way. And this is really a line of business scenario when you think of something like a shopping cart that might have nested items. So there's a package that has sub-items that you want to edit, and then there's your first class items, and so you want to stack them and display them differently. And what implicit data templates does is it says in this list that has a bunch of widgets bound to it. So in this case, I'm using the example, I have a social feed, but it might have different types of feed items. So it might have a Flickr item, it might have a Twitter item, it might have a blog item. Based on the type, you're going to use a different template. And so it allows you to specify the template over here, and then anything else that needs to refer it, it'll implicitly find the right way to show that piece of information. So it's implied based on the data type, and then I don't need to specify any type of data template on my list box because I have all these implied data templates above. With ancestor binding, this is another classic case that stumps a lot of people when they come to Silverlight. And we have this concept of a view model, which is this one class on the view that exposes properties. One example might be I have a list of items that I'm editing, so it exposes that list of items, and then that list shows on the screen. And maybe I have a nice user interface that for each item I can edit and delete and perform some other actions against it. Well, the problem is when I'm working in the context of that item, my data that I'm working with is no longer that view model class. It's that item. So I might have widget view model with a list of widgets, but when I'm making my button, I'm stuck on just widget. And widget doesn't know about commands or any of the other plumbing and action types that I have. And so there used to be a lot of exotic ways that people would get back up to that because I don't want to add the command to the widget class because it shouldn't know about a delete command. It just knows, hey, I'm a widget. Ancestor data binding lets us actually bind, so if I'm on that widget, I can bind to the delete command and walk up the tree. So that's what ancestor binding means. I'm a child of a parent of a parent of a parent. So here I'm inside a list box, and a list box has a data template that's inside a grid that's inside so on and so forth. So I'm saying walk up and find the third grid above me and use whatever they're bound to, which in this case is my view model. And so I'm binding to the delete command and in the command parameter passing myself to it. So it binds to the current data to context. So it allows more flexibility basically on your layout for getting to things you need to get to. And then finally we have data binding debugging. Now this I've heard a lot about XAML debugging. We don't have XAML debugging in Silverlight. So XAML, for those of you who don't know, who are coming in without that background, it's really a declarative language to create objects. When in a nutshell, that's what it does. You instance classes, and a lot of the time those classes are user interface objects, things like grids and lists and whatnot. They can be other things. What data binding debugging does is it says when I bind it to my view model or to a widget or whatever, I can now set a breakpoint and see what's going on with that, because the classic issue is that I wire everything up, it looks beautiful, I'm using MVVM pattern, I've got a nice style template that I downloaded and applied because I can't make styles myself, and I run it, and my things aren't showing up. And why is that? Well, before you used to have to kind of guess and troubleshoot and look closely. Now I can set the breakpoint, I can look at it and say, well, pointing at, you know, an author object, and I'm thinking I'm looking at a book object, for example. And this is an example when it pulls up in the debugger of what that looks like. So in the XAML, I've set the breakpoint. It's popped up, and in my locals, I can see the data context is this implicit view model. So now I know exactly what that data binding is pointing to, and I can tweak it and make my corrections as necessary. So I'm not debugging all of the XAML. I couldn't set a breakpoint up above because there's not a binding statement there, just the data binding aspect. So let's take a look at data binding in Silverlight 5. So in our data binding examples, this is the style data binding. So what I've done is what you saw. I've got this theme class, and the style's bound to the theme class. And this is actually my own style, by the way. I made this myself. Thank you. Hold the applause. And what will happen is when we click the cycle button, you can see it dynamically change. Now the text is green, still unreadable, but now we're on a up and down, which would be vertical gradient. And if I cycle again, now we have a horizontal gradient, and the text is now red. And so that's a dynamic binding. And if you take a look at the example down here within the data binding, in my class, it's actually really simple, and this is designer friendly. So you can see it renders just as well in Visual Studio when I'm not running it as it did when I was actually in the browser. And I'm binding in the style. So this is a style definition here, and I've brought in my theme class, and I'm binding just directly in the style to the gradient brush property for the background of the grid. And then I'm setting some text attributes, but for the foreground color, I'm binding to this solid brush property. And that's it. That's the code there. And of course, the cycle button has a command to cycle it. If we look at what it's actually binding to, which would be in my themes, so this is the code of the class it's binding to. And what it does is it points to a resource dictionary that contains themes in it. So the theme dictionary has like gradient brush this, solid color brush that, all the FF, BE, FO, hashtag things that those designers hand to us and we do something with. And I'm parsing that and grabbing all of the gradients and putting them into a list of gradient brushes. I'm grabbing all the solid color brushes and putting them into a list of solid color brushes. And then anytime I receive a message to change whatever that is, I'm basically just cycling through my index and raising property change, and that's in Silverlight with the data binding. I change the property, I have to tell Silverlight the property changed, and that's what that's doing. If we look at the implicit data templates, I'm sorry you're already seeing enough of me. You're going to have to bear with a little bit more. This is my Twitter avatar, and I've got sample tweets that appear to be in Latin, of all things, and blog posts and whatnot. This is data that I actually just spun up on the fly, but you can see there's a Flickr format, which is just an image with a title. There's a Twitter format that has, you know, who it came from, the avatar, the tweet, and the date, and then there's a blog format that has the little RSS feed indicator. Now the way this worked, and you're going to see a little bit of complaint in the designer, because the Silverlight SDK doesn't update the design component of Visual Studio. So the designer doesn't know about implicit data templates yet, even though the runtime does. That will be fixed, obviously, in the final version. Blend that comes with the beta does understand implicit data templates. But if we take a look at it, I've got these templates here. So there's like a blog template, a photo template, a tweet template, and these are just empty XAML files. You can see in the code behind, they don't do anything special. They're just defining a generic template. And then in the example, and there you see my fun message, hey, that's invalid when it's really not, but that's okay, we'll roll with it. The resources here say when it's a photo, use the photo template. When it's a blog post, use the blog template. And I'm binding to this social feed. Social feed is actually a list of type object that can take a blog or a photo or something else and have that inserted onto it. And if you're interested in that piece, we can do the implicit view model. You can see I'm wiring up some Commodore 64, TI-99, Trash 80, dating myself with my sample images. And this is an observable collection right here with just that social feed of type object. And so the helper spins up data, stuffs it in there, binds, and the implicit template draws it, and everyone's happy. With ancestor binding, it's not as exciting to demo, but I thought I'd show you anyway. And it's probably more interesting to see the XAML first. If we take a look in our data binding, ancestor binding, so what we've got, again, design time friendly too, is a grid that has this list box of blogs. And if you saw in the view model, if you peeped ahead when I was showing you the list of social feeds, blogs is just a link query that says only grab out the blog types from that same list. So I'm reusing that same view model. And it's binding to the blogs and it's showing some things, but here's the interesting part is that in my orange button, I'm binding to this ancestor type of grid. So even though technically where I'm at is on a blog post, I'm binding up to the view model that hosts it and getting to the delete command. And then what we can actually do, because it's firing off the view model, which just removes it, we can sit here and tap this all day long and watch the scroll bar thumb get a little bit larger, right, eventually. So that's where that's going. On the user interface, there's a couple miscellaneous changes. We've got click counting, text search, and vector-based printing. So on click counting, it's basically what we used to have to do is have a timer, and every time someone clicked, say, did the timer expire? Okay, that's a double click. And your version of a double click might be different timing than my version of a double click, and the user probably doesn't like it. Now Silverlight says what the operating system standard for a double click is, I'm going to expose that and give you a click count. So if the user double clicks, I'm going to give you one event with a click count of 2 for that double click. Text search is something with list boxes where you used to have to drag and scroll and click. And if you wanted to actually let the person type a selection, you had to wire that up yourself. Now you can say, with this list, here's a path of text that's meaningful for that item. And if the user starts typing that text, select it for me. So it allows some keyboard interaction, which if you're like me, I love the keyboard. The mouse slows me down. And so I want to be able to type and move through quickly that way. Vector-based printing I can't demo, and it's actually not in the beta, but it's implemented in an interesting way. The same API from the previous versions of Silverlight is there, but it used to send all these rasterized graphics. So it used to pixelate everything and shove it over, which meant, A, you had this huge overhead. I mean, some complex reports would just be phenomenally huge. And B, you have no fidelity. If the resolution on the printer is great or small or whatever, you get pixelated and choppy graphics. Now, to the extent it can, obviously if you send a bitmap to the printer, it's still going to be a bitmap. But if you send fonts and paths and other UI elements, it'll translate those to Postscript vectors and send them to the printer in that vectorized format. This is huge for line of business. It's been one of the big blockers that I always run into with customers, is that they can't have a first-class printing experience from Silverlight. This brings us a lot closer to that because now we can create those first class. So this is what click count looks like, and it's pretty easy to use. If you're a first-time Silverlight programmer, I recommend taking a stab at this because you look at the click count and you count it. So it's an easy operation, 1, 2, 3, so on and so forth. The text search, I've got a class that has a path to an image and a name. And then in the list box, I'm just telling it, use the name for when the user's typing and trying to select something. So it'll match the first characters of the property. And then the printing, we talked about Postscript. There's going to be a virtual print view. Don't know what that looks like, but so the user can preview it before they actually print. It'll reduce size, footprint, so on, so forth. Let's jump into a quick demo. And so when we look at our UI examples, I can do single click, click, click. If I do it a little faster, I get the double click, and I can even get a triple click. So it's just counting clicks, which isn't all that exciting, but it's consistent at least now, right? If I put the focus on my list box now, I can press R and select the RSS feed. So I no longer have to navigate with my cursor, which is one of those small things that just helps round out the entire experience. So let's get into some of the more complex. I'm doing a time check here, so we've got, it's like 15 minutes. So custom markup and types. Custom markup extensions are cool. They're groovy, they're flexible, they do a lot for us. So in that XAML markup where we're creating all these classes, we used to be bound by whatever Silverlight shipped for what we can do. Sometimes we have frameworks or we have utilities and methods that we want to put in that XAML to help things out, and we really can't because there's no mechanism to do it. And what custom markup extensions does is allows us to create basically a new syntax that you place into XAML to do interesting things, and I'll show you an example of what that is. We also have custom types. Custom types are new classes that you create on the fly. Now we've had dynamic with Silverlight. Anyone familiar with dynamic? Show hands. So a few people, which allowed you to create things, but it wasn't bindable. You couldn't like make a grid off a dynamic type. So with iCustom Type Provider, you can create a type on the fly and bind it to a grid. So things like visualizing data that you don't know about beforehand, you can use this to create a class on the fly, bind to the class, and show that data. So with a custom markup extension, sort of like attributes. I don't know if anyone's done custom attributes, but if you want to make an attribute called markup, you call it markup attribute. So with a custom markup extension, if you want view model glue, then you name it view model glue extension, and you derive from markup extension. It passes in the service provider, which is neat because when I show you where we put the custom markup extension, it's somewhere in that XAML, right? This gives me a way to navigate and see, am I on a property, am I on a class, and where am I at, so I can do something interesting with that. Optionally reach out, grab the target object, so on and so forth. So here, for my data context, instead of using a binding command, I'm using my own view model glue command. And so in Jounce, which is a framework I have for MVVM that's based on the Managed Extensibility Framework, we tag view models just with a user-friendly name. Here I have custom view model, so it's not based on the type, it's just based on the name. And that's so if I have one in another file that I may load down the road, I can still reference it. I don't have a dependency on that type. It can be dynamically loaded later. What this is saying is I want you to go out and basically find the one with that tag and wire it into this view for me. And I've created this through a custom mechanism. The custom type provider inherits this interface called iCustom Type Provider, which is very dangerous because it only has one method, so it looks so simple, right? You just have to return your custom type. The problem is you have to implement everything about that custom type. So if you've ever done anything with reflection, there's a lot of attributes about classes, there's a way to get methods and properties. You have to basically emulate all of that with your custom type, and if you can do that, then you can create a new type on the fly. So in this case, I've created a custom type. I'm adding a property called age, that's an integer, making an instance of that type, and then setting that age value. This age did not exist before now, but literally in my data binding, I can now bind directly to age, and it will work. Totally bindable. So let's do a demo of that. So with the custom markup extension, this part really isn't interesting. I can type some stuff, I can say show me, blah, 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 I get a pop-up and the background changes. And I even borrowed the background. I wish I could have been creative enough to come up with my own orange gradient, but I have to admit it was borrowed. What is interesting is that instead of the usual engine that this whole application runs off of, that you'll take a look at if you download the source, this uses a custom markup extension. So I've written this extension here in Jounce Extensions called View Model Glue extension. And it's doing some things with the Managed Extensibility Framework, which are out of scope from this talk, but basically I'm able to wire it up, go out, find some things, pull them in, and ultimately I'm wiring something called the visual state, which allows me to affect the state of the view indirectly. I don't have to know about brushes or anything, I just know there's a state called orange state, or probably not even orange state, right? Press state, unpressed state, mouse hover state, and let the rest of the style engine take care of the rest. And then it's setting the data context as well and calling some methods. So it does quite a bit in that extension. But after doing all of that, what it allows me to do is in my XAML, in my examples here, if I look at custom markup view, and again it's designer friendly, so I can have text and everything within the designer, but I'm literally using this view model glue command and telling it to go out and do all the plumbing for me at runtime. And then you saw it's completely active, it's impacting the style, the theme, it's allowing me to run commands, and this is all I needed to wire the two together, and this does not give me a dependency on a type. So in the designer I can return a design time type that gives me fun, fluffy data to work with, and in the runtime I can have a deep, rich, interacts with services and does a zillion other things in the background. Now this is probably going to be underwhelming when I click on this tab, the custom type example, because I'll click on it and what you'll see is a graph of the planets and their relative mass to the Earth and their diameter in kilometers. Whoopee, right? We've seen a million graphs. What's interesting about this is when we look at the XAML for this custom type, you can see we're using this data grid and we're telling it to auto-generate the columns and we're binding it to this object called planets. So let's go take a look at what this object called planets is. So we'll go into our view model and you'll see planets is a list of custom type. So that's what it's binding to. If we look at that custom type, it's got an ID here and then a bunch of these helper methods, but you won't see anything that says planet or diameter or name or anything like that. It's just a shallow type. What actually happened was we embedded some JSON data into the project. So if I go through and look at my assets, maybe not there. Oh, where are you? If anyone sees a planets.json pop up all of a sudden, sample data, there we go. So we've got this JSON data. And what we did was we parsed the JSON, looked at what the attributes were, dynamically created a type, and then bound that type to the list. So what we can do is, if someone wants to just call out a new property name that we can add to this. Anyone? Color? So we'll add a color property for the planet, and I think Mercury is probably gray. I don't know. Should we use the British or the... So we'll add this property, we'll come down and zoom through. Let's make Venus yellow, I think. We can make Earth blue. We can make Mars red. We can make Jupiter, let's call it banded. And let's actually copy that because then I can cheat for Saturn, right? Pretty sure this might be, let's just call it blue again. Let's call Neptune, I don't know, I like green, maybe. What do you think? Should Pluto be blue or black?
Brown.
Not a planet, according to some people. So now this is the tricky part. I'll give you a caveat. Because I'm working off the network, Silverlight tends to get a little bit wonky. So what I'm going to do is actually switch to my out of browser mode. We'll set this as our startup project. And recompile that way. Hopefully we'll get a nice pop-up without any network complaints. Go to the custom type example, and now you see we've got our color. And I can sort and do everything I wanted to do with that custom type that was created.
And can you show the code which parses the JSON behind?
Absolutely. Let's jump into that. I know we're getting a little tight on time, and I want to show you one more thing, but let me pull that up for you. So I've got this JSON helper, and all it really does is using system.json namespace, it'll parse JSON for me and give it to me as a dictionary, so string object. I'm doing some very light parsing of if it's, I'll try to see, could it be an int, could it be a double, could it be a string, so I have a type, and obviously my fall through is that I'll just treat it as a string. And then literally I have this extension method that loops through those keys and calls set value. Set value is a delegate that's passed in, so I'm deferring how I actually set the value. That is on my custom type helper. So I've got all these helper methods that, remember, I have to emulate what a type looks like. So obviously we'd be here for quite a while, but you'll have access to that class with the source code. So if you look at the parsing logic now in the view model, so let's go back to planet view model. So I'm opening a stream to my JSON, loading it as an array of objects here. If it's null, I'm not throwing an error, I'm just getting out of town. Then I'm opening this helper, passing the template to it. I'm saying I want you to map it to the custom type. So that is looping through and saying, hey, we've got a name, we've got a diameter, we've got a mass, etc. And then I'm saying go ahead and map it using this method called setPropertyValue, which is saying set, diameter, comma, and the value, and adding it. So a few helper methods, and then this is my entire view model to parse it and bind it. So the last piece, trusted applications can now run inside the browser. There are a lot of implications with running trust inside the browser. So there is a lot of complexity to the setup. It's policy-based. You have to manipulate the registry. And I actually think it's a good thing that you have to jump through so many hoops, because now you're saying someone can execute something in the browser that writes to the entire file system. So I have a version of a database that runs on local storage, and there's a purge command that deletes everything under the database command. You can imagine if I was testing that and I didn't have these policies, how things could go south. We can also create multiple windows, and we'll take a look at that, and we can access the entire file system. It used to be just restricted to special folders. So here is how you create a tearaway child window in out-of-browser. It's only out-of-browser apps, but I can now create separate windows for my application. So I might have a dashboard that I want to pull out and have these different windows. And it's pretty simple. You pass it a content, which is really just a framework element. So it might be a grid, it might be a user control, it can be pretty much anything visual. You decide if it's going to be on the top or not, and this defaults to collapse, so you set the visibility of it. What I did in this application is I let it sense if it was running in the browser or an out-of-browser. So if we go back to my implicit data templates and we look at the TRS-80, you'll notice when I click on it, it pops up a completely separate window. So I can have, this window, and it's using the same template for everything else. So now I've got these other windows that I can position independently. I can close the window by itself, and if I close the main application, all the child windows go with it. So the third dimension, I'll show you a really quick demo on that, and then we'll wrap. I know we're getting to the end of our time, but there's 3D support. I left this for the end because it's not as much line of business. There certainly is application in medical imaging and other things for this. I am by no means a 3D expert. It's an XNA-based API, and it provides shaders. It's using vertices, so triangle meshes that map textures onto the object. And we're going to do a demo real quick for that you may have seen. This is actually shipped with the beta download, and this is a texture mapped to a sphere showing the globe. And I can do population density, and you can see it's a bump map, so it's actually 3D mapped onto the globe. I can show the mesh that makes up the globe. I can even give it a magnetic field and manipulate that. So it's a pretty fluid. You can see it's very responsive. I'm also recording this while I'm showing it to you, so there's a lot going on. And it works quite nicely. Now the other piece is I will post this to my blog so that it's available for you to download. It's based on a framework called Jounce, and Rick Robinson will have a session on Jounce, which is an MVVM framework for Silverlight, based on meth, and that's tomorrow, 3:10 p.m., room 403. That's my Twitter address. I tweet tons of Silverlight information. I try to keep a high signal-to-noise ratio. When announcements like yesterday come out, the noise might go up a little bit, but hey, we have fun with it. And this is my blog. This is where I'll be posting the full source code to download and play with on the Silverlight 5 application. I'll also put the slide deck on, And if the recording actually turned out, I'll post it there as well for you so that you can go back and review that. Questions? Anyway.
Go back one screen.
Yes.
Thank you.
I'll leave it on this one, but any other questions? Yes, sir.
Did Microsoft make a projection on when they will RTM?
They said the end of 2011. And honestly, even though I know a lot more than probably you know, I still don't know more about that date. So I can't even drop subtle hints about it. I just know it's going to be near the end of the year. Yes, sir.
Can you tell us any more about the Office integration? Do you know anything about that?
No, I don't, because it's not in the beta and they haven't exposed APIs. I'm assuming it's going to be something similar to the native extensions where there's some wrappers that they provide that make it easier through the COM or the pinvoke layer to do that.
I had heard that they're going to make it easy to read and write the Office format.
Right, and I think they're surfacing up some of that API, but they have not released those details. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.